Welcome back to Forum Daily News. I'm Wyatt Sharpe, and this is your U.S. election tracker update. Well, we are really coming down to the final stretch of this election campaign now. Kamala Harris is set to give a closing argument speech on the National Mall this coming Tuesday. Former President Trump is still crisscrossing the country. He's going to be visiting several states over the course of the next few weeks. He's already visited some states that are perhaps atypical for a Republican presidential nominee, states like New York or California. Joining us now to discuss some of these various strategies is political strategist Rob Burgess. Rob, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me back, Wyatt.
Perhaps let's just start out with the fact that, as I mentioned in the introduction there, former President Donald Trump is visiting some of these states like California, like New York. I mean, politically speaking, it's not like he has a huge chance at winning either of those two states, just historically speaking. What would be the overall purpose of visiting a state like New York or California or even some of the other ones he's visited?
What it's coming down to is forcing the Kamala Harris campaign to spend resources in states that they would traditionally feel are safe. At the end of the day, there is a higher likelihood, and we're seeing it in polling, that voters do not necessarily align with the message that Kamala Harris is trying to sell. And that's even happening in states like New York and California. So by going there and pulling margin away from her, he's forcing her to campaign in states that she typically would ignore because she wants to focus on those seven swing states. And so it's simply forcing her to spend resources across the country and making it harder for her to compete in those seven swings.
And I mean, I guess if we're talking about some of these swing states, it's interesting how the dynamic has kind of shifted. If you think about 2008 or 2012, where President Obama was able to win a state like Florida. And then, of course, recently, Florida becoming much more Republican. If you look at Ron DeSantis's victory in 2022, how does the dynamic of swing states no longer being swing states kind of change things up for someone like Kamala Harris, who has perhaps had to change some of her internal work almost to be prepared for some states that she wasn't necessarily expecting to be as hard to win as they are.
Sure. I think that in our political system, we see states move in and out of that swing state status, right? It wasn't too long ago that California actually voted red in presidential elections. And so we also have to realize that as demographics move, right, as people move across the country or into different states, their politics moves with them. And so we've seen Florida get a little deeper red. We're starting to see parts of Texas become a little bit more purple. And then we're starting to see states like Ohio stop becoming purple and become deeper red. What that means is political campaigns need to be nimble. They need to be able to adjust their strategy and the way they look at the electoral map. And I think that's what you're seeing with this Donald Trump team. Chris LaCivita and Susie Wiles have run a magnificent campaign since the primaries, and they've positioned this campaign for the long run, making sure that they're able to focus on these seven swings, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona, Nevada. And that's really where this race is going to come down to. And I think that, if I had to make a guess, it's probably going to come down to Pennsylvania.
And of course, that was last time as well. If we think about what has changed from 2020 until now, obviously the Democratic nominee is different, but a lot of their campaign team is still basically identical to what it was beforehand. You have some of their policies, which Kamala Harris said recently she wouldn't really change a thing from what the Biden-Harris administration had done. Obviously, she's been a part of this administration here. How can the Trump campaign, I guess they kind of have been, but really utilize that in their messaging? Look, Kamala Harris is no different than Joe Biden, so to speak.
Well, I don't think that necessarily the Trump campaign has to do anything to highlight it. Kamala Harris is doing it on her own. Like you said, she wasn't able to identify one thing that she would do differently than Joe Biden had in the last 3.5 years. She has been in charge of the border wall for 3.5 years, or the southern border, I'm sorry, and she's just now recognizing there's a problem and she wants to secure the border. Last night's media blitz, the CNN town hall shows you that her messaging's not right? In the last 92 days, her vision for America is not resonating. And you start seeing that in polling, not only across the country, where I think this morning's poll has Donald Trump almost 1.5 points nationally, but in the swing states where everything's down to a margin of error race, right? So now she's pivoting back to the Biden messaging, where it's attacking Donald Trump's character rather than attacking his policies. And quite frankly, undecided voters in the suburban areas, and especially female voters, they don't like that type of vitriol campaigning. They don't like it when you can't talk about policy. They do not like it when you can't talk about how you're going to keep their children safe. How are you going to make sure that their schools are well prepared to, put them into the next generation? Or how we're going to make healthcare affordable again.